So dolls aren't obscure. At least they weren't in the early 2000s when they were a ubiquitous presence on message boards, signatures, AIM icons, and of course, live journal profiles. Now they've mostly been relegated to nostalgia content, fodder for videos like mine, I guess, while the dress-up games that walk in their footsteps get their time in the limelight. And make no mistake, the Picrew and Everskies and Monster Girl makers of today are evolutions of what came before. The Flash dolls, Gaia Online, Palace dolls, and yes, even paper dolls. Girls have been playing with dolls for like a really long time. I found papers going as far back as the 50s discussing why that might be, though as you may expect, those older ones tend to have some pretty whack ideas about why little girls do what they do. But dolls date back even further than the 50s. Probably the oldest known dress-up doll is the paper doll, which is supposed to be about as old as paper itself, apparently. Many of these were used in rituals or were created by special craftsmen, such as the origami kimono made in Japan as long ago as 800 CE. Paper dolls gained popularity with high society in Europe in the later 1600s, but the first paper doll manufactured on like a mass scale as a toy was Little Fanny in 1810. So one of the reasons I'm talking about paper dolls right now is that I think that there's a lot of similarities between paper dolls and like virtual dress-up dolls. One of the things that makes these things so similar is the accessibility of them. Paper dolls were inexpensive toys and they could be printed for cheap. And because of that, they got super popular during the Great Depression, at least here in the US. And while having a computer and internet access isn't cheap exactly, and it certainly wasn't in the 90s and 2000s, users who have access to these two things have so many more options with practically infinite choices for dress up all at their fingertips. Or at least they do now. The dolls I'm talking about, that's dolls with a Z by the way, of course, weren't the first virtual dolls. Dress up PC software has existed since the first Barbie game at least, which released on the Commodore 64 and allowed players to dress up the titular character. And later in the 90s, a software called the Kisekai Set System started to gain popularity online. Kisekai, or Kiss dolls, originated in Japan. And I might be mispronouncing this, sorry about that, but Kisekai is literally Japanese for dress up. And these were specially coded programs used to dress up mostly like anime and video game characters that were popular in Japan. These dolls used a special software that had to be downloaded and used as an app, and then users would download dolls as like little add-on content. So you downloaded the dolls separately from the program itself. As the system gained popularity in the West, mostly through anime and video game fan sites, Western users began creating their own Kiss dolls, exploring the boundaries of what dolls could be aesthetically while also creating their own original characters and backstories, in some cases even using the software to do the storytelling itself. I'm going so hard into Kiss dolls right now because the Kiss doll system was my first brush with virtual dolls. See, I was a frequent visitor of Sailor Moon fan sites, some of which shared illicit Sailor Moon ROMs, which is also how I got into game emulation, by the way. Sailor Moon was basically my gateway to being the huge nerd that I am today. So thank you, Sailor Moon, for that. Anyway, while looking for more ROMs, my friend and I stumbled across a site that hosted a wide variety of Sailor Moon themed Kiss dolls, and we were totally hooked. And I think that's really interesting because I was not what you would call a girly girl. I'm still not. I never cared about clothing before stumbling across these dolls, but for some reason, I was totally transfixed. I would spend hours tweaking and reworking outfits and sending the screenshots to my friends or using them as icons for my AIM or my live journal. I was most fascinated with the original character dolls, which often allowed for the users to project themselves in their place. This doll right here was one of my favorites because she looked like me. She had brown hair and glasses. She was a fan of JRPGs and Hot Topic bondage pants, just like me at the time. It struck me as odd at the time that I was spending hours playing with virtual paper dolls since I had never had much of an interest in Barbies or physical dolls before. So why now was I so interested in the intricacies of coordinating an outfit? What I didn't know was that I was part of a huge wave of kids who were experimenting and finding ways to express themselves through pixelated dolls. But those are all the forerunners, right? Those are the guys that came first. So let's talk about Palace dolls. Okay, so what I call Palace dolls actually have a lot of names. You might have heard them go by one of these instead. Barbies, cartoon dolls, most commonly preps. I call them Palace dolls because that's what I associate them with. The Palace, a pre-Second Life Snow Crash style graphical chat that was popular when I was definitely too young to be hanging out in chat rooms. If you only know these dolls from their appearances and signatures and doll makers, then you might not know about the Palace. The Palace was sort of awesome. If you weren't there, it's kind of impossible to describe how everyone was in chat rooms in the 90s, and graphical chats where you could represent yourself in something resembling physical space was, in the language of the time, the shit. It was no VR chat, but we were all convinced that this is the future. Users selected an avatar and joined one of a number of different themed chat rooms. These rooms were dedicated to topics from bands to hobbies to like just chatting. There was a main palace gathering place, but a lot of the servers were decentralized, run on users' private computers. The default avatar, also called AVs, I'm going to say AVs, was a 3D smiley face that could express different emotions and a little bit of individuality. But the real idea was to upload your own original avatar, and users of the palace quickly began to get creative and made their own. Fun fact, at least to me, the word avatar originally referred to the worldly body of a descended god in Sanskrit, as in Hindu tradition, gods can take any earthly shape. The word gained popularity in gaming and sci-fi novels like the aforementioned Snow Crash, where people imagined futures where needing virtual representation of oneself would be much more prevalent. Eventually, people started using the term avatar in bulletin board systems, and like these nerds carried that word forward into places like the palace, where it became common usage. Anyway, so users of the palace were uploading their own images. And like a lot of these were actually copyrighted. Anime was always popular, of course, but there were also superheroes and other Western cartoons, photos of celebrities, but more and more people were creating their own digital illustrations pixel by pixel. This is where the history starts to get a little wonky and I could get really down deep in the weeds, but this is supposed to be a quick video, so we're going to talk about what kind of emerged. There are two main stories for what dolls sort of originated the palace dolls. According to the most popular of these, a creator named Innocence started creating a bunch of dolls. Her real name was Melisha Greenwood, and she was bored with the smiley faces and ripped cartoon graphics that populated the palace chat rooms. She started drawing her own, and then, as they became popular, she started giving them out to anyone who asked for one. She said on her now defunct website that they weren't called dolls then, they were called Lil People, and then skaters or preps, as based on their style. So the other story is the Rain Man story. It's worth noting that the palace officially notes Rain Man's Little People as the first popular cartoon doll on the site. They originated around the same time. I don't know who came first, but they were both super influential, though it was Innocence doll bases that would make up the majority of the prep bases to come later. Rain Man's Little People obviously had an influence on future dolls, but the design itself didn't stick around very long. Anyway, the creation of these dolls itself kind of created something of a rift in the palace community that would only grow with time. The people using these specific avatars to express themselves skewed younger, teenage creatives who wanted to express themselves in this brand new media. The palace had a pretty even gender split, something that the palace's creators claimed that they were very proud of because the internet at the time in the mid-90s was considered to be mostly male. There was a broad audience with variety in both age and interest. One of the aforementioned band rooms that I mentioned before actually belonged to the nu metal band Korn. The palace apparently had this really big metalhead community, and Korn themselves even visited the palace a number of times to answer questions in the chat room and just interact with fans. As you can imagine, the Venn diagram of 30-year-old metal dudes and the people who created pixel dolls based on Barbie did not have a lot of overlap, although there was some. Anyway, so the dolls became kind of a uniform for the more rebellious underground section of the site, populated mostly by teens. And they were like everywhere. As far as I can tell, if you were an adult on this site, you could not get rid of them. They were like little pests. They trolled and had dress-up competitions for their doll bases, and were generally frowned upon by the older community. A number of former palace users maintained that they ruined the early atmosphere of the site. It's also worth noting that eventually some rifts did heal, and some of the more rabble-rousy, trolly side of the dolls fandom, I guess, kind of like faded away or moved on to something else, or just like in general grew up. However, as time went on, these dolls started leaking away from the palace, and thus began something of a mainstreaming of preps. Though, to be honest, I don't know that I would ever say that dolls were like totally mainstream, and by this point they weren't as ubiquitous as they would become. But people were discovering them. Dollars, artists who would draw on the bases in programs like Paint and Photoshop, were starting to display their work on their own websites, and word was getting out. I can't find a lot of information about the first drag and drop doll makers, but these were undoubtedly the start of the boom. Drawing little clothes for the doll by hand with a mouse was not easy, so making your own custom AV was time consuming and not very accessible. As more people started to try their hand at dolling, the dolls changed to reflect a shift in, like, let's say skill level. Skaters grew smaller, cuter, and way easier to draw on. A tank top that's only like 12 pixels high is way easier to draw and make look good than one that's like 40 pixels high, for example. The smaller the doll, the easier it is for people who are new to dolling to work with. But it wasn't until the drag and drop doll makers that everyday internet users had a chance to make their own unique AV. So let's talk about them. Part 3, the doll makers. So the first doll maker I ever used was on The Palace. The Doll Palace was a website that hosted a ton of different dolls as well as various drag and drop doll makers. It was not related to The Palace, the chat program, outside of the fact that it had a very similar name that I think was probably a sort of a wink wink nudge nudge to the idea that dolls came from or sort of originated at The Palace itself. But the Doll Palace was not owned by the same people that created and ran The Palace. Eventually, there would be so many more. Like, I want to say there were hundreds. There were doll makers for any theme that you could think of. Angels, demons, Playboy bunnies, moms, goth girls, fairies, and of course, the giant doll makers, the all-in-one doll makers that shoved all of the disparate parts into one gigantic page that took at least 5 minutes to load on your dial-up internet and took forever to scroll through to find all the parts that you wanted. This was one of the reasons, by the way, that the niche doll makers were so popular. They were quicker to load, and you didn't have to worry about parts you didn't care about. Different sites dedicated to cartoon dolls had their own doll makers. Dollars would make their own parts and then put them on their own drag and drop sites, which was a way to bring traffic to their website. Some people were still interested in the bespoke dolls that you could download from people's websites, from people who had handcrafted them pixel by pixel in some art editor. But more and more people were interested in creating their own doll for themselves, and so these doll creators would put drag and drop makers on their sites. Some of these had some really unique and incredible pieces made by the person who hosted the site. The idea was that each drag and drop maker hosted by a particular artist would have their own work on it. It was taboo to hack up and steal other creators' hard work and put it into your own doll or doll maker, but that didn't mean that Franken-dolls, or dolls made out of pieces from other artists, didn't exist. It was sometimes obvious when the creator of a drag and drop tool had done this, as like the pieces wouldn't match or they would have drastically different line art or shading styles. This could be very frustrating and was also like really popular on some of the bigger doll maker sites as people worked to get bigger doll makers with more parts to draw in more folks. Anyway, finding a doll maker with original pieces was always like the best, as well as finding one that had whatever the new hotness was. New doll types were popping up all of the time. So preps were the first one that I remember seeing, but skaters and their little subtypes soon followed. Since these were also super popular on the Palace, they were the other kind that had a lot of drag and drop makers, kind of from the beginning. As I said before, skaters were these tiny little guys, easy to pose and pretty expressive considering the limited real estate for their face. And then skaters got smaller, and these variants were called minis. Minis kind of became the de facto skaters, the umbrella term, which were folded into a subtype of these types of dolls, which included baby dolls, mini goths, ravers, which are just minis but with like super neon clothing. The teensification of dolls really reached a head with Silence, which I don't know how to describe. They were even smaller, skinnier minis with closed eyes and a sort of melancholy expression. These were actually my favorite growing up, by the way. I don't know why. Something about them really spoke to me. I think they're really cute and they just seem lost in thought and totally contemplative, and that really spoke to 12-year-old me. At the same time as everyone was seeing how small they could make these things, others were playing with the larger dolls, mostly, like I said, the preps, and a brand new doll called Wonderkins. These guys looked like little Precious Moments characters with giant heads and pouty baby faces. I always thought they walked a fine line between cute and uncanny pretty well. I remember them being big with couples because despite obviously being teenagers, they have this innocent quality that makes their romance seem sweet and not vulgar in some way. Like, as a comparison, the preps also had male bases, but they were, I don't know, they were just not right in some ways, like the head, the body, and there was always a skeezy quality to the prep couples. Other dolls on the larger side were Bratz and Divas, which were both based on doll lines popular at the time. You know Bratz, you know what I'm talking about. I was always a big fan of the Divas. I think I liked their big eyes, and I was always more disappointed that they never really took off, which was probably due to their lack of clothing options and poses. You know, they all look like cookie cutter versions of each other, which is kind of true of other popular dolls, especially preps, but preps found a way to make themselves a little different and differentiate themselves, and I guess just Divas never did that. So this was supposed to be the part of the video where I went through a bunch of old doll sites that I found that still had parts on them and still functioned, and I was going to show them off and talk about them, but for the most part they just simply don't run anymore. It's pretty sad, but it looks like a lot of them use scripts that are just not compatible with modern day browsers, and I spent a little bit of time getting a few of them to work, and some of them they just need a little bit of tweaking. But for the most part, I would say if you Google these, about 80% of them are just simply not going to work. And later in the video, I talk about the effort to archive flash dolls and how the same has not been done for these dolls. And I think that is very, very clear here in the last few hours that I've spent looking into what has happened with these doll makers and how even the ones that still have websites online and the graphics still load, just the scripts just simply don't work anymore. I did find a few that worked, and I might put in a couple of little clips here and there of me experiencing them and getting a little bit of nostalgia. Yeah. Gay pride. Yeah, with the Doll Palace, you could choose which parts you wanted. So you could say, oh, I like these like dark hair, so I want dark hair, and I want these pants. Oh, look, pregnant. The mom maker is. Oh, premium. You have to pay for premium for those. You can only get one for free. I think I spent way too much time on this site when I was a kid. It has not been updated since 2005. How you doing, person who made Yummylicious? You are incredible. Now, this is legit. These are cute. Hey! It's a Doggle Fox from Neopets and a Boris from Neopets. A Harris, I mean Boris. And a Noel. They've ripped off a number of Neopets and just straight up Yoshi. Oh, I want to know this celeb is Eminem. Imagine being the kind of girl who loves Eminem but also loves like this sort of cutesy aesthetic. That was me. But the main thing that I actually want to talk about here is something that I found in my research earlier. It ended up coming completely in handy, which is a sort of resurgence of these pixel doll makers. So, of course, as with all of these, there are pixel doll makers communities. And for example, there is one on Reddit. And I found a link to a list of sites that's a couple of months old that is a list of currently working doll makers in 2021. And some of these are older doll makers that still work, which is wonderful. But some of these, for example, dolls.neocities.org, are people who are sort of reviving the pixel dolling hobby. For whatever reason, they have a nostalgia for this type of content and creating it, and they want to bring back the old doll makers. So I spent a little bit of time on those, and I can put some clips in of that here too. Oh, there's a chatterbox. The scene kid look. One thing that I want to say now that I've experienced what it's like to try and find these working doll makers is that, yeah, the archival process for this is, it's completely underwhelming. And it absolutely makes sense that would be the case. This is a super niche hobby. It was niche even back in the day when it was at its most popular. And now it is very unlikely that people are going to want to take and put in the time to go back through and take all these graphics and fix the scripts and make them work on modern browsers. It's just probably not worth all of the effort. But I do find it really cool and interesting that while there are some people who are trying to get the old doll makers working, there are even more people who are interested in remaking those doll makers from scratch, changing the way that they look, and bringing back browser-based drag and drop doll making programs. I just think that is really, really cool. And yeah, I just wanted to stick this in here in the original script. But yeah, anyway, back to the original script. The drag and drop creators reached their peak in the early 2000s. In 2003, Salon published an article called Playing with Dolls, detailing the phenomenon to the wider public. Dolls were now a common sight. They frequented AIM and MSN icons and signatures. I remember them being big on Zynga. Remember Zynga? And on people's Neopets pages, especially like in their stores, for a brief time. With their penchant for quotes and cutesy little sayings, you might call a doll an early meme, at least in the original definition of the term. An idea that gets passed around the internet, spreading a little bit like a virus. In that way, it's not surprising that the dolls fell out of popularity almost as quickly as they'd risen. Memes never stick around for long, even in the early 2000s. Reminders of the things that we used to be into are, as they say, cringe. And for a lot of us, the sincerity with which we thought a doll wearing trip pants saying, "You laugh because I'm different, I laugh because you're all the same," was like the coolest shit. It's just embarrassing in hindsight. So dolls faded away. I remember the thing that replaced them on everybody's website being glitter text quotes, which was actually a lot easier to make yourself if you had access to Photoshop. There were probably other new fads as well, but I just kept playing with kiss dolls, which were growing in complexity and were much more interesting to me artistically speaking. But Gaia Online was also happening at this time and really blowing up, and I'm sure a lot of people who liked dolls were moving there. Gaia and the Palace had a lot of similarities, but the role-playing nature of the shop shops and money making on Gaia was appealing for a lot of people, as well as the anime aesthetic, which the palace did not have. But dolls didn't go away forever. Giant maker sites like Dolls Mania stuck around for a really long time. I actually had a friend in high school who used one of the fairy doll makers to inspire her Amy Brown style fairy art that she would draw during our after school art club, a thing that I remember finding fascinated and kind of re-sparked a love of dolls for me. But the mid-2000s was having another boom, a flash boom, and what were really starting to take off then were flash doll makers. I remember thinking these are a lot more like Kiss dolls because they were more paper doll style. You dragged the clothes onto a base instead of dragging a whole bunch of parts together. The similarities to Kiss is probably what kept me away from them, as well as my age. Kiss dolls just had a lot more functionality programmed into them from the beginning, at least in those days, though the flash dolls would eventually become more complex. Many of them used flash style art, so the doll bases were larger and more detailed in some ways, while Kiss dolls still used pixel art. Eventually, as time went on, the art became truly incredible, and the flash doll maker sites grew to be even larger than the palace, with a much wider variety of dolls. One of the things that I haven't mentioned, but which may have become obvious to you as I was showing off the earlier dolls, was the real lack of diversity in the doll making community in the 90s and early 2000s. Preps, Silence, Wonderkins, with few exceptions, they represented a very narrow slice of the community. They were mostly women, mostly white, and never anything but thin and able-bodied. Well, except for the mom preps, I guess. They weren't thin, exactly. There were a few dolls that tried to rectify this problem. BBW dolls did exist, but they never really gained widespread popularity, and the use of the term BBW is sort of like sexualized even then, so I think it may never have gained popularity just based on the name. And some prep parts had darker skin tones, though there weren't that many of them, and there were a few attempts to make entire doll lines with darker skin tones. Those were, I don't know what the intention was here, if this was an attempt at inclusivity or if this was just out and out racism, but this is not it. Flash doll makers weren't perfect, but they were at least a little bit better in this regard and would continue to get better as time went on. And nowadays, doll makers and avatar programs are much more diverse than ever. Picrew is especially good in this regard, with users able to choose from a variety of skin tones, weight, disability, and even rep their gender or sexual orientation if they want. So doll makers are alive and well here in 2021. Some have even been turned into video and mobile games, returning to their Commodore 64 roots, like the Style Savvy and Love Nikki series, which I love. There are efforts to restore and archive the old Flash doll makers, which is like wonderful, but fewer efforts have been made for the old Dragon Drops. Most of these didn't use Flash, so they don't really need saving post the Flash apocalypse outside of the usual archival of old internet that's just being chipped away at every day. So this was just my little attempt to remember and talk about them. While we still can remember this little thing that Salon thought was so strange, it was worth writing an entire article about. The idea of virtual dress-up is just, in general, much less unusual now. I think the main reason loops back to the reason I was so confused about playing with doll makers in the first place. I was convinced that the only reason that anyone would want to play with dolls is because they were a girly girl who liked fashion and wanted to play with clothes. But I was deeply wrong. Dolls are a way to express yourself. And I think that as a culture, we understand that a lot more now than we did back then. I think we get that it's important to let teens, and really people of all ages, explore their presentation and creativity in a way that's safe and without judgment. Kids who could never or would never dress goth can try out an alternative style and see how it fits, in a sense. Or girls just starting to explore their sexuality and their bodies can wear more revealing clothing in a virtual setting that might feel more comfortable to them than something that they would actually wear. Or someone questioning their gender might try on an avatar that doesn't look like them, giving them space to try out different clothes and pronouns. I think that this kind of exploration is normal and natural and very healthy, and a virtual space is infinitely more accessible and safe than attempting these things in real life for a lot of kids. The rise in popularity in things like Picrew and Everskies gives me hope that these kinds of spaces will be available for teens and others in the future, and prove to me that the idea of doll playing and creating an avatar will never truly go out of style. So tell me about your favorite dolls. What websites did you use, and what was your favorite kind? Were you more of a Flash kid, or do you know the Palace dolls that I was talking about? I want to know. If you want to see more nostalgia content like this, please subscribe. My next video is another Degrassi retrospective, but if you want more internet nostalgia stuff, let me know. Tell me what you're interested in, and maybe give this video a like because it helps me out a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I hope you have a great day.